Before we begin reading, we will cover a few items. Although I will be reading the book for you, you are still expected to be following along with me at all times in your hard copy. You will hear as I read. When you hear, please turn the page. Also, bits of information and captions are written along the pages of your book. I will not be reading that information. However, you may go back and read this after the recording is complete. Please open your book to page 3 as we will begin reading. Crowds of people streamed in and out of the main bus station in Washington, D.C. It seemed to be a typical day for hundreds of travelers, but for 13 people, 7 of them black, 6 of them white, this day was far from ordinary. It was May 4th, 1961. These 13 men and women were setting out to challenge the segregationist laws that had existed in the South for nearly 100 years. They were a vanguard of a revolution that would eventually crush an old order. History remembers them as the Freedom Riders. Shortly after the Civil War, the defeated Southern states had enacted a series of Jim Crow laws. The term Jim Crow comes from an obedient, uncomplaining black character popular in the 19th century minstrel shows. Jim Crow laws restricted the rights of black peoples and kept them segregated from whites. For example, blacks were required to ride in separate cars at the back of the railroad trains. On buses, they had to sit at the rear and had to give up their seat whenever a white rider was left standing. Blacks had to use separate restrooms and eat in separate restaurants, drink at separate water fountains, even read separate tables in public libraries. Blacks had no power to change the Jim Crow law system because other laws prohibited them from voting. Then in 1950s, African Americans began to take action against these unfair laws. In 1955, Rosa Parks, a seamstress from Montgomery, Alabama, was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a bus to a white person. Her action inspired Montgomery's black citizens to boycott the city's bus system. Rather than take the bus, blacks organized carpools, walked, or stayed home. The boycott went on for more than a year. As a result, both the bus system and Montgomery's downtown business suffered huge financial losses. At last, the United States Supreme Court ruled that Alabama's state and local laws requiring segregation on buses were unconstitutional, and therefore illegal. Montgomery was ordered to desegregate its buses. A few years later, black college students began sit-ins at whites-only lunch counters in the South. These protesters sat quietly but resolutely at the counters until they were served or taken to jail. Though small victories were being achieved in the struggle to end Jim Crow practices, for the most part, the Deep South continued to resist such changes. A 1946 Supreme Court decision had outlawed segregation in interstate railroads and buses. Another ruling in 1960 made segregated facilities in bus and train terminals illegal. But in spite of these rulings, the Deep South refused to desegregate its facilities. It simply ignored the federal laws. Now, in 1961, the Freedom Riders were launching a fresh assault on the system that had kept Jim Crow alive for so long. We decided the way to do it was to have an interracial group ride through the South, Freedom Rider James Farmer later explained. This was not civil disobedience, really, because we would be merely doing what the Supreme Court said we had a right to do. We felt we could count on the racists of the South to create a crisis so that the federal government would be compelled to enforce the law. As the bus rolled south towards New Orleans, the trip's final destination, the Freedom Riders openly defied Jim Crow practices. White passengers took seats in the rear, while black riders sat up front. Whenever they stopped at a bus terminal, the whites went on to the colored washrooms and waiting areas, and the blacks used the facilities marked whites only. James Farmer, who organized and led the Freedom Riders, was the director of the Congress of Racial Equality. For 20 years, he had studied the philosophy and techniques of nonviolent protest. Nonviolent resistance had been used successfully by the great spiritual leader Mahatma Gandhi to help the people of India throw off British rule in 1947. Farmer was one of the many black leaders who hoped to use Gandhi's methods to win equal rights for African Americans. We were told that the segregationists, would go to any extent to hold the line of segregation in interstate travel. Farmer said in an interview years later, "So when we began the ride, I think all of us were prepared for as much violence as could be thrown at us. We were prepared for the possibility of death." At first, as the Greyhound bus headed south, the Freedom Riders encountered little opposition. But in Rock Hill, South Carolina, a fistfight broke out as white teenagers tried to prevent the blacks from using their washrooms. The police quickly broke up the fight. Apart from that skirmish, the Freedom Riders met no violence as they crossed Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia.